Under the merciless Arizona sun, Thunder stood untamed and defiant. 17 hands of pure muscle and fury, the stallion had broken more bones than the local doctor could count. Men came from 3 counties just to watch cowboys try and fail to tame him. Elizabeth Montgomery, the only daughter of the wealthiest rancher in the territory, lifted her chin with pride. "No man can ride this beast," she announced, her voice carrying across the dusty corral. That's when the crowd parted. A tall Apache stepped forward, his face weathered like the mountains he called home. Without a word, he approached the snorting stallion. In one fluid motion, he mounted the beast that had defeated dozens. The stallion froze, then calmed. But would this silent stranger also tame the wild spirit of the woman who watched him with newfound respect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montgomery Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of Arizona territory, a testament to Thomas Montgomery's 20 years of sweat and determination. The main house stood proudly on a gentle rise, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the morning light. Inside, Elizabeth Montgomery yanked a brush through her unruly auburn hair, still fuming about yesterday's humiliation at the corral. "Lizzie, you'll tear your scalp raw," said Martha, the housekeeper who'd raised her since her mother's passing in childbirth 18 years ago. "I don't care," Elizabeth muttered, glaring at her reflection. That Indian made me look like a fool." "You made yourself look like a fool, challenging all mankind in front of half the county." Martha's weathered hands gently took the brush. "Your father's asking for you. The bank manager's visiting again." Elizabeth's frustration gave way to concern. The ranch's financial troubles weren't a secret to her, though her father tried to shield her from the worst of it. The drought had taken its toll on cattle prices, and the new railroad had changed everything. The land deed framed above her father's desk, once a symbol of prosperity, now seemed like a shackle. In the study, Thomas Montgomery stood by the window, his once broad shoulders now slightly stooped with worry. At 53, lines etched his tanned face deeper than they should have. He turned as Elizabeth entered. "There's my girl. Sleep well." "Well enough," she lied, unwilling to admit she'd tossed all night, replaying the moment that Apache had tamed Thunder so effortlessly. "Harrington's son is coming by today. James. Fine young man, Harvard educated." Elizabeth stiffened. "If you're matchmaking again, I'm doing what any father would." Thomas's voice held an edge of desperation. "Elizabeth, be reasonable. The bank's calling in loans all over the territory. The Harrington connection could save everything I've built for you. By selling me off?" The words hung between them. Thomas sighed. "By securing your future. That stallion of yours could fetch a handsome price from the right buyer." "You can't sell Thunder." The words burst from her before she could temper them. "I can and I will, unless you have a better solution." Thomas rubbed his forehead. "That beast has nearly killed 3 hands. He's dangerous and expensive to keep. He's the finest bloodline in the territory, worth 10 times what any buyer would pay, if only he could be properly trained for breeding. Which he can't, because no one can handle him." Thomas paused. "Except, apparently, that Apache hand foreman hired yesterday." Elizabeth's cheeks burned at the reminder. A lucky moment. Thunder was probably just surprised. "Charlie says he's some kind of horse whisperer. Doesn't talk though, mute or just stubborn, nobody knows." A knock at the door interrupted them. Foreman Charlie entered, hat in hand. "Boss, that new Indian hand? He's doing something strange with your daughter's devil horse. Thought you might want to see." Elizabeth was out the door before her father could respond. Her skirts gathered in her fists as she ran toward the corral. There, the tall Apache stood motionless in the center, Thunder circling him slowly, nostrils flared but calm. No rope, no bridle, no whip, The ranch hands watched in silent awe from the fence. Elizabeth approached slowly, unwilling to disrupt whatever magic was happening. The Apache's eyes flicked to her briefly dark, unfathomable eyes that seemed to look right through her pretenses. "How is he doing that?" she whispered to Charlie. "Damned if I know, Miss Lizzie. Been at it since dawn. Horse comes closer each round." Thomas appeared beside them, his expression calculating. "What's his name?" "Calls himself Maka, according to the trading post fella who recommended him. Means earth, or something in Apache. Man said he's the best horse handler he's ever seen, but keeps to himself. Some trouble with the army years back, but nothing proven." Elizabeth couldn't look away from the silent dance in the corral. For the first time since Thunder had been born on their land 3 years ago, the stallion seemed almost peaceful. And the man at the center of the corral stood with a quiet dignity that made the usual cowboys seem like blustering children. She would never admit it aloud, but in that moment, Elizabeth Montgomery felt the first tremor of something shifting within her. A curiosity that went beyond wounded pride. Maka slept beneath the stars rather than in the bunkhouse with the other hands. The white men's quarters felt too confined, too filled with stale breath and suspicious glances. Out here, with only the vast Arizona sky above him, he could almost forget. Almost. His fingers touched the small medicine pouch at his neck, the leather worn smooth from years of the same gesture. Inside, a scrap of his mother's blanket, a smooth stone from the river where his father had taught him to fish, and a small carved horse his grandfather had made. All that remained of his people, the small band of Chiricahua who had raised him before the soldiers came. The memories came in the darkness, whether he invited them or not. The thunder of hooves, the crack of rifles, his mother pushing him into a narrow crevice in the rocks. "Do not make a sound, my son. Not one sound." He hadn't spoken since. 14 summers had passed. 14 winters of moving from ranch to ranch, letting his hands speak through the language of horses. The animals understood silence better than men did. They recognized the truth in stillness. "You planning to sleep out here all summer?" Maka turned to see Charlie, the foreman, approaching with a lantern. He didn't answer, just nodded once. "Suit yourself. But there's a storm coming tomorrow." Charlie squatted down nearby, close enough to talk, far enough to respect boundaries. That was something today with thunder. Never seen anything like it. Maka made a gesture with his hand, sweeping it in a circle, then bringing it to rest. "Patience, huh? Well, you've got that in spades." Charlie scratched his graying beard. "The boss's daughter is another story. Headstrong as that stallion. Been that way since her mama died birthing her." Maka's eyes flickered with something like recognition. "Miss Elizabeth practically grew up on horseback. Rides better than most men I know. Problem is, she knows it." Charlie chuckled. "Surprised she didn't try to outride you today after what happened at the corral yesterday." Maka reached for a stick and drew in the dirt. A horse, a rider, falling. "She's been thrown." Charlie leaned closer to see the drawing in the dim light. "Nah, not often. Though thunders tossed her a few times. Never deterred her. Girls got more grit than sense sometimes." Maka nodded, a small gesture of respect. "Listen," Charlie's voice lowered. "Some of the boys don't take kindly to, well, your kind being here. I hired you because you're the best I've seen with horses, and we need that stallion gentled. But watch your back." Maka touched his knife, then nodded. The warning was unnecessary, but the concern seemed genuine. Charlie was different from most white men. He judged by skill, not skin. "Miss Elizabeth will be watching you work tomorrow. She's Thunder's rightful owner. Her daddy gave that colt to her when it was born. She won't give him up easy." Charlie stood, knees cracking. "Just so you know." After the foreman left, Maka lay back on his bedroll. The woman's face appeared in his mind, her green eyes flashing defiance, auburn hair escaping its pins in the dusty corral. He'd noticed her long before yesterday's challenge. He'd watched her ride across the fields, fearless and free, when she thought no one was looking. She reminded him of the wild horses that still ran in the mountains. Beautiful, dangerous to approach without understanding. The thought almost made him smile. In the distance, thunder nickered softly from his corral. The horse was calling to him. Maka rose silently and walked to the fence. The massive black stallion approached cautiously, nostrils flaring to catch his scent. Maka extended his hand, palm up, not grabbing, not demanding, offering. Thunder's velvet muzzle brushed his fingers, a gesture of tentative trust. He's never done that with anyone. Maka turned, surprised to find Elizabeth standing in the shadows, a shawl wrapped around her nightdress. He hadn't heard her approach, unusual for him. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice softer than he'd heard it before, without its public edge. Maka simply looked at the horse, then back at her. The answer was there if she could see it. Elizabeth stepped closer, moonlight silvering her hair. "Will you teach me?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Morning brought the promised storm clouds and a carriage rolling up the long drive to the Montgomery ranch house. Elizabeth watched from the parlor window as a young man in an expensive suit descended, handing his hat to a servant before striding confidently toward the front door. "James Harrington," her father announced unnecessarily as he adjusted his string tie. His father owns the largest cattle operation in the territory. Harvard educated. "You mentioned that yesterday," Elizabeth said dryly. Thomas frowned. "Be civil, Elizabeth. The Harringtons could be powerful allies. Or they could buy out our struggling neighbors and build their empire on others' misfortune," she countered, having heard rumors at the general store. Before Thomas could respond, Martha showed James into the parlor. He was handsome in the conventional way of Eastern men. Clean-shaven, hair precisely parted, confident smile revealing perfect teeth. "Miss Montgomery," he bowed slightly. "Your father's descriptions didn't do you justice." Elizabeth forced a polite smile. "Mr. Harrington, welcome to our home. James has expressed interest in our breeding stock," Thomas explained, clapping the younger man on the shoulder. "Particularly Thunder." Elizabeth's smile froze. "Thunder isn't for sale. Every horse has its price," James said smoothly. "And I understand this one's particularly challenging. Perhaps beyond practical use for a family operation like yours." "I've trained him myself," Elizabeth lied. "Have you?" James's skepticism was thinly veiled. "I heard an interesting tale in town about an Apache breaking him just yesterday." Elizabeth felt heat rising to her cheeks. A momentary success. The real training has barely begun. "Either way," Thomas interjected, "I've been considering an offer from the military. They're looking for strong studs to improve their cavalry mounts." "Father!" Elizabeth couldn't contain her shock. "You can't sell him to the army. They'd break his spirit completely." James watched the exchange with interest. "Perhaps we could observe this magnificent animal? I'd like to form my own opinion." Outside, the wind had picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the yard. Thunder paced his corral nervously, sensing the coming storm. Nearby, Maka was mending a section of fence, his movements economical and precise. He glanced up as the trio approached, his dark eyes noting the fancy boots and store-bought spurs of the visitor. "That's him?" James asked, eyeing Maka with undisguised contempt before turning to Thunder. "Impressive animal, despite his temperament issues." $500, Thomas said. "He's yours." "No." Elizabeth stepped between her father and James, a silver dollar clutched suddenly in her palm. She'd been carrying it since her midnight conversation with Maka. "I have a proposition." Thomas sighed. "Elizabeth, a wager." She held up the coin. "Give me 2 months to make Thunder suitable for breeding and riding. If I succeed, he stays with us and becomes the foundation of a new breeding program that could save the ranch. And if you fail? Thomas asked. Then you can sell him to Mr. Harrington or the army or whoever you please. Her voice didn't waver despite the knot in her stomach. James laughed softly. You can't possibly tame that beast alone. She won't be alone, came Charlie's voice as the foreman approached. She'll have our new hand helping her. He nodded toward Maka, who had stopped working to watch them. The savage. James snorted. Well, that changes the odds considerably. Elizabeth bristled but held her tongue. What do you say, father? 2 months. Thomas studied his daughter, then looked at the storm clouds gathering. Finally, he nodded. 2 months. But I want to see regular progress, and Maka must be directly involved. No point wasting time if yesterday was just luck. Elizabeth flipped the silver dollar, catching it and slapping it onto the back of her hand. Heads, it's a deal. She lifted her hand to reveal the coin. Heads. It's settled then, Thomas said, not looking entirely pleased. 2 months starting today. James adjusted his jacket, visibly annoyed. I'll be checking in regularly, Thomas. And I'll keep my offer open. For now. As James and Thomas walked back toward the house, Elizabeth approached Maka, who had watched the entire exchange in silence. It seems we're partners, she said, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. Are you willing? Maka studied her for a long moment, then gave a single, deliberate nod. He gestured toward the gathering clouds, then to the corral. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. We should begin before the storm hits. Neither noticed James watching them from the porch, his handsome face darkened by something more ominous than the approaching weather. The storm passed overnight, leaving behind mud and a crystalline clarity to the morning air. Elizabeth arrived at the corral before dawn, dressed in split riding skirts and a sturdy cotton blouse. She found Maka already there, motionless in the center of the enclosure, Thunder circling him at a respectful distance. Good morning, she called, climbing the fence. Maka acknowledged her with the barest nod, never taking his eyes off the stallion. Elizabeth dropped down into the mud beside him, a training rope coiled in her hand. I thought we'd start with basic commands, she said, uncoiling the rope. I've been using standard braking techniques, but perhaps, before she could finish, Maka's hand closed gently around her wrist. He shook his head once, then took the rope from her, coiling it differently, looser with a softer loop. That's not how Sullivan taught me, she protested, naming the ranch's previous horse trainer. You need a firm hand with Thunder. He's stubborn. Maka's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Elizabeth fall silent. He handed the recoiled rope back to her, then motioned for her to stay still. With deliberate slowness, he approached Thunder, his posture relaxed, hands open at his sides. Thunder snorted, pawing the ground nervously. Elizabeth tensed, expecting the stallion to charge or bolt as he had so many times before. Instead, Maka began to make a low, humming sound, not quite singing, but rhythmic and soothing. The horse's ears flicked forward with interest. That's remarkable, Elizabeth whispered, forgetting her earlier certainty. Maka continued his approach until he stood directly before Thunder. With exquisite gentleness, he reached out and stroked the horse's nose. The stallion remained still, accepting the touch. Maka turned and beckoned Elizabeth forward. Me? Now? Her confidence faltered. He'll never let me that close. Maka simply waited, hand extended toward her. Elizabeth swallowed hard and stepped forward, the mud sucking at her boots. Thunder's ears flattened as she approached, and he took a backward step. See? He doesn't trust me. Frustration edged her voice. Maka gestured to her stance, her shoulders, her white-knuckled grip on the rope. Elizabeth realized she was braced as if for battle. Oh! She consciously lowered her shoulders, loosened her grip. Like this. Maka nodded, then motioned for her to continue her approach. This time, Thunder held his ground, though his nostrils flared with each breath. "Now what?" she whispered when she stood beside Maka. He guided her hand up slowly toward Thunder's muzzle. The horse tossed his head nervously. Maka made the humming sound again, and incredibly, Thunder lowered his head once more. "I can't believe it," Elizabeth breathed as her fingertips made contact with the velvety nose. "I've never touched him without him trying to bite me." For the briefest moment, something like a smile ghosted across Maka's face. He stepped back, allowing Elizabeth to maintain the connection alone. Thunder remained calm for several breaths, then abruptly backed away, evidently deciding that was enough vulnerability for one day. "That's progress," Elizabeth said, unable to hide her excitement. "Real progress." From the fence, a slow clapping interrupted the moment. James Harrington sat on the top rail, dressed too finely for the early hour. "Charming little circus act," he called. "But I came to see actual horse training, not parlor tricks." Thunder startled at the sudden voice, rearing up with a shrill whinny. He bolted across the corral, directly toward Elizabeth. She froze, the beast's massive hooves a heartbeat away from trampling her. In a blur of movement, Maka shoved her aside, both of them tumbling into the mud as Thunder thundered past, barely missing them. They landed hard, Maka's body partly covering hers, his quick action saving her from serious injury or worse. For one suspended moment, Elizabeth found herself looking directly into Maka's eyes, their faces inches apart. Something electric passed between them before he quickly rolled away, helping her to her feet with a strong hand. "Are you hurt?" James called, suddenly concerned as he jumped down from the fence. "I'm fine," Elizabeth said, brushing mud from her clothes, her heart racing for more than just the near miss. "No thanks to your interruption." Maka was already moving toward Thunder, who had retreated to the far corner of the corral. His body language had changed, more assertive now, establishing boundaries the stallion had violated. "Perhaps that's enough excitement for one day," James suggested, taking Elizabeth's arm. "You should come inside and recover." She pulled away. "We've only just begun." Her eyes found Makara's across the corral, and she gave him a small nod of gratitude. James noticed the exchange, his jaw tightening. "I see. Well, I'll leave you to your training methods." He tipped his hat stiffly. "Good day, Miss Montgomery." As James strode away, Elizabeth turned back to Maka and Thunder. "Shall we continue?" she asked, her voice steadier than her still trembling hands. A week into their training partnership, Elizabeth suggested they travel to town for supplies. "We need a special bit for Thunder," she explained to Maka as they loaded the wagon. "Something gentler than what we have." Maka nodded, though his expression suggested uncertainty about the trip. He rarely ventured into Copper Springs, preferring the open spaces of the ranch to the cramped buildings and suspicious stares of the settlement. The 12-mile journey passed mostly in silence, but not uncomfortably so. Elizabeth had grown accustomed to Maka's quietude, finding it restful after the constant chatter of ranch life. Occasionally, she would ask him questions he could answer with gestures or expressions, developing a language between them that required no words. "You've made remarkable progress with Thunder," she said as the wagon rattled along the dusty road. "Father's impressed, though he won't admit it." Maka's mouth quirked in what she now recognized as his version of a smile. "James keeps finding excuses to visit," she continued, flicking the reins lightly. "I think he hopes we'll fail." Maka's face darkened momentarily. "Don't worry," Elizabeth assured him. "We won't." Copper Springs appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden buildings stretched along a single main street. As they entered town, Elizabeth noticed how Maka's posture changed. More rigid, eyes constantly moving, scanning for threats. She realized with a pang how different his experience of this place must be from hers. They hitched the wagon outside Jenkins' Mercantile. "I won't be long," Elizabeth promised. But Maka surprised her by jumping down to accompany her inside. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. A list of items they needed, she realized, written in a careful, surprisingly elegant hand. "You can write," she said, momentarily taken aback. He nodded once, then gestured toward the store. Inside, Mr. Jenkins greeted Elizabeth warmly before his expression cooled at the sight of her companion. "Miss Montgomery, didn't expect to see you with company. Mr. Maka is our new horse trainer," she said pointedly. "We need these items." She handed over the list. Jenkins scanned it, lips pursed. "Specialized tack. Have to order some of this from Phoenix." His eyes flicked to Maka. "Your kind usually use rope halters, don't they?" "Nothing so fancy." Elizabeth felt Maka stiffen beside her. "Mr. Maka has exceptional knowledge of horsemanship," she said, her tone sharper than intended. "We'll take whatever you have in stock today and order the rest." As Jenkins gathered their supplies, 3 cowboys entered, smelling of whiskey despite the early hour. One nudged another when he spotted Maka. "Well, look here. Montgomery's got herself an Injun shadow." The tallest of the 3 spat tobacco juice on the plank floor. "Heard you let him ride that devil horse of yours. What else you letting him ride, Miss Montgomery?" Elizabeth's cheeks burned with fury. "How dare you?" "Careful, boys," another cowboy drawled. "That Apache might scalp you in your sleep. They're sneaky like that." Maka remained perfectly still, his face impassive, but Elizabeth saw his hand drift toward the knife at his belt. "That's enough," Jenkins called from behind the counter, more concerned about potential damage to his store than the insults. "Take your business elsewhere if you're looking for trouble." "No trouble," the first cowboy said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just making conversation with our Apache friend here. Does he even understand English? Or just grunt and point?" Elizabeth stepped between them, green eyes flashing. "Mr. Maka understands perfectly well that you're embarrassing yourselves and this town. Now step aside." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the saloon doors across the street swung open, and Sheriff Taylor emerged, squinting in the sunlight. The cowboys backed down. "No offense meant, Miss Montgomery," the ringleader muttered. "Just funning." As they exited, Elizabeth realized her hands were shaking with anger. She turned to Maka, whose expression remained unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He shook his head slightly, as if to say it didn't matter, or perhaps that he was accustomed to such treatment. Their purchases complete, they stepped back onto the boardwalk where they found James Harrington waiting beside their wagon. "Elizabeth!" He greeted her with exaggerated warmth. "What a pleasant surprise. I was just heading to my father's bank." He barely acknowledged Maka. "Are you in town long? Perhaps you'll join me for lunch at the hotel." "We need to return to the ranch," Elizabeth declined, noticing how Maka had already climbed onto the wagon, his eyes scanning the street warily. "Shame," James said, "but I'll be calling on you tomorrow. Your father has invited me to dinner." His smile didn't reach his eyes as they flicked to Maka. "Just family and appropriate company." As they drove out of town, Elizabeth glanced at Maka's profile, wondering how many such slights and insults he had endured in silence over the years, and why he continued to live among people who treated him with such contempt. Rain drummed steadily on the barn roof as Elizabeth and Maka worked with thunder in the relative dryness of the large stall. 3 weeks had passed since their wager began, and progress was undeniable. The once wild stallion now accepted a saddle without bucking, though riding him remained a distant goal. "The bit is still troubling him," Elizabeth observed as Thunder tossed his head irritably at the metal in his mouth. "Perhaps we're rushing this step." Maka nodded, gently removing the bridle from the stallion's head. He made a flowing gesture with his hands that Elizabeth had come to understand meant patience. I know," she sighed, "but we're halfway to our deadline, and father expects a riding demonstration soon. Thunder nudged Makara's shoulder affectionately, then retreated to the far corner of the stall to nibble hay. The transformation in the horse's behavior was remarkable. He now sought out human contact rather than fleeing from it. "You should rest," Elizabeth told Maka, noticing the weariness in his shoulders. "It's been a long day." He nodded gratefully and gathered his tools while Elizabeth gave Thunder a final pat. As Maka reached for his saddlebag, a small leather-bound book fell onto the straw-covered floor. He moved quickly to retrieve it, but not before Elizabeth glimpsed the pages filled with neat handwriting. "Is that a journal?" she asked, unable to mask her surprise. Maka hesitated, then slowly extended the book toward her, a gesture of trust that took her breath away. Elizabeth accepted it with careful hands. "May I?" At his nod, she opened the journal. Inside were not only words but detailed sketches, horses in various poses, landscapes, and a beautiful rendering of Thunder mid-gallop. "These are extraordinary," she murmured, turning pages with growing wonder. The writing was in English, the penmanship elegant and educated. "You were taught to read and write?" Maka took a stick and wrote in the loose dirt of the barn floor, "Mission school." "Before." "Before what?" Elizabeth asked softly. He hesitated, then wrote simply, "Soldiers." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "That's why you don't speak." He nodded once, his gaze distant with memory. Elizabeth continued turning pages, stopping at an entry dated just a week earlier. Asterisk, "The rancher's daughter is learning." Slowly, her hands grow gentler, her patience stronger. Thunder responds. Today he took the saddle without fear. She smiled then. Not at me, but it lightened something in my chest nonetheless. Asterisk. Heat rushed to Elizabeth's cheeks. "You've been writing about me." Maka didn't deny it, watching her with those unfathomable dark eyes. "I've been unfair to you," she admitted, closing the journal and returning it. "I assumed many things that weren't true." He shrugged slightly, as if to say her assumptions were common enough. "No," she insisted. "It matters. I judged you without knowing you, just as I judged Thunder before understanding him." She gestured toward the stallion, now dozing peacefully in the corner. "You've taught me to see differently." Maka's expression softened. He opened the journal again, wrote something quickly, and handed it back to her. Asterisk, "We learn together. Horse. Human. No difference in the heart." Asterisk. A lump formed in Elizabeth's throat. Yes, exactly that. A moment stretched between them, fragile and new. Then, surprising them both, Elizabeth laughed. A bright, genuine sound that echoed in the rafters. Thunder's head came up, ears pricked with interest. "What must you think of me?" she said, still smiling. "The spoiled rancher's daughter who thought she knew everything about horses until you came along." Makara's lips curved into a real smile, the first she'd seen from him. He wrote again in the dirt. "Brave, stubborn, learning. High praise indeed, coming from you," she teased, finding this new way of communicating strangely freeing. The rain intensified outside, a sudden downpour that drowned out all other sounds. Maka picked up the journal, hesitated, then wrote one more message before tucking it away. "Storm passing soon, like anger, like fear." Elizabeth nodded, understanding he meant more than just the weather. "Will you write more?" she asked. "About Thunder's training? It might help my father understand our methods better." Maka considered this, then nodded, a new openness in his expression. "Good," she said, brushing straw from her skirt. "And perhaps you might teach me some of your language sometime? Fair exchange for all you've learned of mine." His eyes widened slightly in surprise, then warmed with something that looked remarkably like hope. He nodded once more, definitively. Neither noticed James Harrington standing in the shadows of the barn entrance, watching their exchange with cold, calculating eyes. A riding party is just what everyone needs, James announced at breakfast, having invited himself to the Montgomery table yet again. My sister Catherine is visiting from Boston and dying to see the countryside. I thought perhaps tomorrow we might show her the canyon trails. Thomas nodded approvingly. Excellent idea. Elizabeth could use a day away from that stallion. She's been working too hard. Elizabeth opened her mouth to protest, then reconsidered. A ride might actually be good for clearing her head. The past month of intensive training with Thunder and Maka had left little time for anything else. Catherine is about your age, James continued, smiling at Elizabeth. I think you'll find her charming company. Much more suitable than... He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Maka should join us, Elizabeth said firmly. He knows the trails better than anyone. James's smile tightened. Is that necessary? I was thinking of a more civilized outing. The Apache knows where the water holes are, Thomas interjected practically. Been an unusually dry season. Could be useful. And so it was settled, much to James's evident displeasure. The following morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of day that shimmered with heat before the sun fully rose. Elizabeth dressed in her riding clothes, selecting a light blouse that would breathe in the desert heat. As she pinned her hair up, she found herself wondering if Maka would approve of her practical attire, then stopped, confused by why his opinion should matter. The riding party assembled at 9. James and his sister Catherine, a pale, blonde girl with a nervous disposition, Elizabeth and her father, and Maka, who appeared silently with 4 canteens of water and a small pack of provisions. Is all that necessary? James asked with a dismissive laugh. We'll be back by mid-afternoon. Maka simply secured the provisions to his saddle. Elizabeth noticed he kept glancing at the distant mountains, where a faint haze hung on the horizon. Problem? She asked quietly. He made a subtle gesture toward the south, then a rolling motion with his hand. Storm coming? She interpreted. He nodded, expression grave. We should perhaps stay closer to the ranch, Elizabeth suggested to the group. Nonsense, James said. It's a perfect day. Your Apache is just trying to get out of guiding us. Maka's face remained impassive, but Elizabeth saw the slight tightening around his eyes. He doesn't speak, but he's not deaf, she said coldly. And he has a name. The first hour of riding passed pleasantly enough. Catherine turned out to be more interesting than Elizabeth had expected, sharing stories of Boston society with self-deprecating humor. Thomas and James rode ahead, deep in discussion about cattle prices and railroad expansion. Maka trailed behind, watchful as always. Occasionally, Elizabeth would drop back to ride beside him, asking questions about plants or landmarks they passed. He would answer with gestures or by writing briefly in a small notebook he now carried for their communications. Your friend is quite handsome, in an exotic way, Catherine commented when they stopped at a water hole, though rather intimidating with his silence. He has his reasons, Elizabeth replied, oddly protective. Catherine raised an eyebrow. James says he's dangerous. James says many things, Elizabeth muttered. As they prepared to continue, Maka approached with urgency in his movements. He pointed to the darkening southern sky, then made a slashing motion across his throat. We need to turn back, Elizabeth translated. The storm is coming faster than expected. James scoffed. A little rain won't hurt us. Flash floods in these canyons are no laughing matter, Thomas said, suddenly serious. If Maka is concerned, we should head back. They turned toward home, picking up their pace. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of rain and electricity. Within minutes, the sky darkened dramatically, and fat drops began to fall. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Not the horse, but its namesake. There's a shortcut through that narrow pass, James shouted over the rising wind, pointing to a gap between towering rock walls. It'll save us half an hour. No, Elizabeth called back. That's a wash. But James was already leading Catherine and Thomas toward the gap. Elizabeth hesitated, looking to Maka, who shook his head emphatically. Father, wait, she called, spurring her horse after them. They had barely entered the narrow passage when the roar began, a distant rumbling that grew rapidly louder. Maka galloped forward, gesturing frantically for everyone to climb. Flash flood, Thomas shouted, finally understanding. Get to high ground. Everything happened in terrifying seconds. A wall of muddy water surged around the bend. James and Catherine managed to scramble up one rocky slope, Thomas another. Elizabeth's horse panicked, rearing as Maka reached for her reins. She tumbled from the saddle just as the water hit, sweeping both her and Maka away from the others. The last thing she heard was her father shouting her name before the roar of water drowned out all other sound. Elizabeth coughed violently, expelling muddy water from her lungs as strong hands pulled her onto a rocky shelf. Her vision swam, the world tilting and spinning before Makara's concerned face came into focus above her. The others? She gasped. He made a gesture indicating separation, then pointed upstream. Are they safe? A nod, though his expression suggested he couldn't be certain. The flash flood had carried them nearly half a mile downstream before Maka had managed to grab a protruding tree root and pull them from the churning current. Now they sat on a narrow ledge about 10 feet above the still raging water. Elizabeth's dress was torn, her arms scratched, but she was miraculously uninjured beyond bruises. Makara's shirt was ripped open, revealing a long scar across his ribs that disappeared around his back. You're hurt, she said, reaching toward him. He shook his head, indicating the scar was old. He turned away to wring water from his long hair, inadvertently revealing more extensive scarring across his back. Elizabeth inhaled sharply. What happened to you? Maka stiffened, then slowly reached for the small leather pouch that somehow remained tied around his neck. From it, he withdrew a folded, water-stained paper, miraculously protected inside the oiled leather, and his small pencil. He wrote carefully, Cavalry, when I was 13. They did that to you? Horror filled her voice. To all they didn't kill. He paused, then added, looking for renegades. We weren't. Just my family's band. Elizabeth's hand covered her mouth. And that's when you stopped speaking? He nodded, writing again. Mother said hide. Be silent. I did. Watched everything. The simple words conveyed unspeakable trauma. Elizabeth felt tears welling in her eyes, not of pity but of rage at such injustice. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Maka shrugged slightly, putting the paper away. His expression suggested this was simply his reality, long accepted. Do you know which cavalry unit? She asked after a moment. His eyes sharpened with sudden intensity. He removed the pouch again and withdrew something else, a cavalry insignia, tarnished with age. You've kept this all these years, she said softly. He nodded, then wrote one word. Remember. Thunder rumbled overhead as rain continued to pour. They would be stranded until the water receded, likely until morning. Maka surveyed their surroundings, then pointed to a deeper recession in the cliff face, a shallow cave that would offer better shelter. They settled into the dry space, Maka gathering scattered brush for a small fire. As darkness fell, the small flame cast dancing shadows on the rock walls. Will they be searching for us? Elizabeth asked. Maka nodded, but gestured at the continuing rain and darkness. Not until morning, she interpreted. Silence fell between them, but not uncomfortably so. Elizabeth hugged her knees, suddenly struck by the strangeness of her situation. Alone in the wilderness with a man her society considered dangerous, yet feeling safer than she ever had with James Harrington's polished manners. I should tell you something too, she said finally. About my mother. Maka looked up, waiting. Everyone says she died giving birth to me, which is true, but not the whole truth. Elizabeth stared into the flames. She was 39. The doctors warned her not to have a child at her age, that her heart wasn't strong enough. But my father wanted an heir so badly. Her voice caught. She died because of his pride. Sometimes I think he sees that in me, his stubbornness that killed her. Maka wrote slowly, "Not your fault. I know that here." She tapped her head. "But not here." She placed her hand over her heart. They sat in silence again, each contemplating the weight of the other's revelation. After a while, Maka reached for his pencil again. "Why defend me in town? Risk reputation?" Elizabeth considered the question. "Because it was right," she said simply. "And because I've started to see how wrong so many things are that I once accepted without question." Maka studied her face in the firelight, then wrote, "Brave." "Not really," she countered. "Brave is surviving what you did and still finding gentleness for creatures like thunder." She paused. "Or patience for stubborn women like me." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He wrote one more line before setting the paper aside. "We are not what happened to us. We are what we choose now." As the fire crackled between them, Elizabeth felt something shifting in her understanding of not just this man, but of herself. The search party found them at dawn, Thomas Montgomery's face lined with worry that transformed to relief when he spotted his daughter. Elizabeth and Maka had already begun making their way upstream, following the canyon edge where the floodwaters had receded to mud. "Elizabeth!" her father called, dismounting quickly. "Thank God you're safe." He embraced her tightly, then held her at arm's length to examine her for injuries. "When that water hit—" "I'm fine, father," she assured him. "Maka saved me." Thomas turned to the Apache, something shifting in his weathered face. "Thank you," he said simply, extending his hand. After a slight hesitation, Maka accepted the handshake with a solemn nod. James Harrington hung back, his relief at Elizabeth's safety mingled with obvious displeasure at finding her alone with Maka. "You must be exhausted," he said, urging his horse forward. "Ride with me back to the ranch." "I can ride on my own," Elizabeth replied, accepting a canteen from Charlie. "Where's my horse?" "Returned to the ranch on her own," the foreman said. "Smart animal." As they rode home, Elizabeth found herself repeatedly glancing at Maka, remembering the revelations of the previous night. Each time, she found his eyes already on her, a silent understanding passing between them that made her cheeks warm despite her exhaustion. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Their work with thunder progressed steadily, but something fundamental had changed. Elizabeth began wearing her mother's locket again, a small silver oval containing a tiny portrait, after years of keeping it in a drawer. She was beautiful, Maka wrote one afternoon, noticing Elizabeth touching the locket as they rested in the shade while thunder grazed nearby. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "People say I have her eyes." Maka nodded, confirming the resemblance. "What was your mother like?" she asked carefully. He considered this, then wrote, "Strong. New plants, healing. Good singer." A pause. Then, "Laughed even after everything." Elizabeth smiled at the image. "You have her strength." Their training sessions with thunder now extended into the evenings. The stallion had begun accepting a rider, first Maka, then Elizabeth, for brief periods. They had developed a unique communication system. Hand signals, facial expressions, and occasional written notes that required fewer words as they grew more attuned to each other's thinking. One evening, as sunset painted the hills in gold and crimson, Elizabeth successfully completed a full circuit of the corral on Thunder's back without the stallion showing any sign of distress. "We did it!" she exclaimed as she dismounted, exhilarated. Without thinking, she threw her arms around Maka's neck in celebration. They both froze, the sudden contact unexpected. For one breathless moment, Elizabeth felt his heart racing against hers, saw something flare in his dark eyes before he gently stepped back. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just—" He shook his head, indicating no apology was needed, though his usual composure seemed shaken. From the ranch house porch, James watched through narrowed eyes. He had taken to visiting almost daily, always with some thin pretext of business with Thomas. Now he approached the corral, his boots deliberately loud on the hard-packed earth. "Impressive progress," he commented, his tone suggesting the opposite. "Though I wonder if a half-tamed beast is really suitable for breeding stock. Wildness tends to pass down bloodlines, doesn't it?" The implied insult wasn't lost on either of them. Elizabeth bristled, but Maka placed a calming hand on Thunder's neck, his expression revealing nothing. "Thunder will be fully trained by our deadline," Elizabeth stated firmly. "His bloodline is exceptional." "Speaking of bloodlines," James continued smoothly, "my father is hosting a dinner next week for some investors from San Francisco. Your father has already accepted my invitation for you both." His eyes flickered to Maka. "A society event, you understand." The implicit exclusion hung in the air. Elizabeth felt a surge of loyalty toward Maka warring with her social conditioning. "I'll consider it," she said neutrally. After James departed, an awkward silence fell. Maka busied himself with Thunder's tack while Elizabeth struggled to find words for the emotions tangling inside her. "He has no right to speak to you that way," she finally said. Maka simply shrugged, then wrote, "Your world has many rules. Rules that don't make sense," she replied with sudden fierceness. "Rules that say a man's worth is determined by his ancestry rather than his actions." He studied her face, then wrote carefully, "Dangerous thinking. Perhaps some things need to be dangerous," she answered, meeting his gaze steadily until he was the one who looked away. James arrived at the Montgomery ranch earlier than usual, his polished buggy reflecting the morning sun. He dressed formally despite the heat, Eastern suit, silk waistcoat, gold watch chain glinting across his chest. In his pocket, a small velvet box pressed against his heart like a secret weapon. Thomas greeted him in the study, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey despite the early hour. "You wanted to speak privately, James?" "Yes, sir." James accepted the drink but didn't sip. "It concerns Elizabeth." Thomas settled into his leather chair, eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "I thought it might. Mr. Montgomery, I'll be direct. Your daughter is the most captivating woman I've met since returning from Harvard." James set his untouched whiskey aside. "I've come to ask formally for her hand in marriage." Thomas didn't appear surprised, merely thoughtful. "And what does Elizabeth say about this?" "I haven't yet approached her directly. I wanted to honor tradition by speaking with you first." "Honorable indeed," Thomas murmured, studying the amber liquid in his glass. After a long moment, he said, "You should know our financial situation isn't what it once was, James." "Sir, my interest in Elizabeth has nothing to do with money." "Doesn't it?" Thomas's gaze was penetrating. "The Harrington Bank holds the note on half the ranches in the territory, including this one." James shifted uncomfortably. "My father's business dealings are separate from my intentions toward Elizabeth." "Are they?" Thomas drained his glass. "Let's be frank, young man. Your father's been buying up distressed properties for years. My ranch would be a fine addition to his collection." James flushed. "I assure you." "No need for assurances," Thomas interrupted, standing to refill his glass. "I'm a practical man. Always have been." He turned back to face James. "The drought's been hard. Cattle prices are down. The new railroads changed everything." He sighed heavily. "This land has been Montgomery land for 20 years. I'd like it to stay that way." Understanding dawned in James's eyes. "An alliance between our families would ensure that." "It would," Thomas agreed, "and provide for Elizabeth's future." "Then you approve?" "I do." Thomas extended his hand. Provided Elizabeth accepts, of course. James stood, shaking the older man's hand firmly. Thank you, sir. I'll speak with her today. She's with that stallion as usual, Thomas said, glancing out the window toward the distant corral. And the Apache. James's jaw tightened. I've been meaning to discuss him. There are rumors in town. That man saved my daughter's life, Thomas cut in. Whatever else he may be. Of course, James backpedaled smoothly. Still, his continued presence so close to Elizabeth seems inappropriate. The training deadline is in 2 weeks, Thomas reminded him. After that, we'll see. Outside, unaware of the conversation that would shape her future, Elizabeth laughed as Thunder playfully nudged her shoulder. The stallion had transformed under their patient training, still spirited but no longer fearful or aggressive. He's ready, she told Maka excitedly. Father will have to admit our success. Maka nodded, genuine pride in his eyes as he stroked Thunder's gleaming neck. The morning sun caught the beads on the bracelet at his wrist. His grandmother's, he'd explained in one of their evening conversations. Elizabeth had begun lingering after their training sessions, reluctant to end their time together. Last night, she'd convinced Maka to teach her a few words in Apache, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds until they both dissolved into silent laughter. Now, seeing James approaching in his formal attire, her smile faded. Maka noticed the change instantly, following her gaze to the approaching figure. Elizabeth, James called too cheerfully. What a glorious morning. The stallion looks well. His name is Thunder, she corrected. And yes, he's doing wonderfully. James barely glanced at the horse. Might I have a word? Privately? Elizabeth hesitated, looking to Maka, who had already begun gathering the training equipment, his face carefully blank. I'll just be a moment, she told him, receiving a slight nod in return. James led her to a nearby cottonwood tree, positioning himself so his back was to Maka. I've just spoken with your father, he began, taking her hands in his. Elizabeth gently extracted them. About our future. James reached into his pocket, producing the velvet box. Elizabeth Montgomery, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The question hung in the air between them. From the corner of her eye, Elizabeth saw Maka leading Thunder away, his straight back and measured steps betraying nothing of what he might have overheard. Yet somehow she knew he had heard everything. James, she began, then stopped, genuinely at a loss. This is unexpected. Is it? He smiled confidently. We make a perfect match. Our families, our backgrounds. And I believe we could build genuine affection over time. Affection, not love. The distinction wasn't lost on Elizabeth. I need time to consider, she said finally. James's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, though I should mention your father has already given his blessing. He closed the ring box, returning it to his pocket. I'll call again tomorrow for your answer. As he walked away, Elizabeth remained under the cottonwood, a strange hollowness expanding in her chest as she watched Maka disappear into the barn with Thunder, not looking back once. The annual Copper Springs Summer Festival transformed the dusty frontier town into a whirl of bunting, banners, and bustling activity. Ranchers and their families came from miles around, dressed in their Sunday best despite the July heat. For one day, social divisions blurred slightly as the community celebrated surviving another harsh Arizona year. Elizabeth sat stiffly beside James in his shiny buggy as they approached the town square, her green dress feeling suddenly too tight. She had neither accepted nor rejected his proposal, using Thunder's training as an excuse to delay her answer. Today, however, James had insisted she accompany him to the festival as a courtesy to the community, whatever that meant. You look lovely, James said, placing his hand over hers. Everyone will be watching us. That was precisely what Elizabeth dreaded. Behind them rode Thomas and, At Elizabeth's insistence, Maka, who had been reluctant to attend until she pointed out they needed supplies for Thunder's final training phase. Since James's proposal 3 days ago, Maka had withdrawn into himself, working with Thunder efficiently, but without the warm companionship that had developed between them. Each time Elizabeth tried to speak with him about James, he found some reason to be elsewhere. The town square bustled with activity. Children racing between stalls, women displaying prize quilts and preserves, men gathered around horseshoe pits and impromptu shooting competitions. As their party dismounted, eyes turned toward them, conversations pausing briefly. "Miss Montgomery," called Mrs. Jenkins from the mercantile, "will you help judge the pie contest? We're short a taster." "Of course," Elizabeth agreed, grateful for an excuse to separate from James. "I'll escort you," he insisted, placing a proprietary hand at her elbow. As they made their way through the crowd, Elizabeth noticed people nodding approvingly at them. James greeted everyone by name, playing the role of prospective community leader with practiced charm. "I hear congratulations are in order," Mrs. Patterson said, eyeing Elizabeth's left hand with disappointment when she found no ring. "News travels fast," James replied before Elizabeth could correct the assumption. "Though we haven't made a formal announcement." Elizabeth stiffened. "In fact, there's my father," James interrupted smoothly. "Excuse us a moment, ladies." He steered Elizabeth toward the bank president, an imposing man with the same calculating eyes as his son. Nearby, Elizabeth spotted Maka standing alone near the sheriff's office, watching the festivities with wary attention. "James," boomed Mr. Harrington, "and the lovely Miss Montgomery. When's the happy date, son?" Before James could respond, a commotion erupted across the square. 3 cavalry officers had ridden into town, their blue uniforms stark against the civilian clothing. Elizabeth felt Maka tense even from a distance, saw his hand move instinctively to his medicine pouch. "Lieutenant Crawford," Sheriff Taylor greeted the lead officer. "What brings you to our celebration?" "Just passing through," the lieutenant replied, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it landed on Maka. Something like recognition flickered in his eyes. Elizabeth excused herself from James, moving toward Maka as the lieutenant dismounted and approached him. "Well, well," the officer said, loud enough for nearby conversations to quiet. "Don't I know you, Indian?" Maka remained expressionless, though Elizabeth saw his shoulders tighten. "He doesn't speak, Lieutenant," she said, reaching Maka's side. "And he's with our ranch party." Crawford's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Could have sworn I've seen him before." He touched the saber at his hip. "Maybe up Apache way, few years back?" Maka's face revealed nothing, but Elizabeth felt the tension radiating from him. She saw his eyes fix on the wanted poster tacked to the sheriff's board behind Crawford. Not on the faces of the rustlers pictured, but on the reward offered by Lieutenant J. Crawford, 7th Cavalry. "Miss Montgomery," called James sharply from across the square. "The pie judging is starting." The lieutenant's attention shifted to Elizabeth, taking in her fine dress and educated speech. "You're keeping interesting company, miss," he said with a smirk. "Your father know you're friendly with this one?" "Mr. Maka is our horse trainer," Elizabeth replied coldly. "And yes, my father values his skills highly." Crawford's eyebrows rose. "Does he now? Interesting." He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Enjoy the festival, miss. You too, Apache. We'll catch up another time." As the lieutenant walked away, Elizabeth turned to Maka. "Do you know him?" she whispered. Maka gave a barely perceptible nod, his eyes still on the cavalry officer. "From before? When you were a boy?" Another nod, his jaw tightening. Before she could ask more, James appeared at her side. "There you are," he said, displeasure evident in his tone. "Everyone's waiting." He glanced dismissively at Maka. "You can find your own entertainment, I'm sure." James, please. It's time, Elizabeth. His voice hardened as he took her arm. In fact, I have an announcement to make. Alarm shot through her. What announcement? James smiled, but his eyes remained cold. You'll see. As he led her toward the center of the square where a small band was setting up, Elizabeth looked back to find Maka watching them, his expression unreadable across the crowded distance. Elizabeth paced her bedroom floor, the events of the day replaying in her mind. James had indeed made an announcement, thanking the townsfolk for their support of our upcoming union. As if their engagement were settled fact. She had stood frozen beside him, too shocked to contradict him publicly. Her father had beamed. The community had applauded. And Maka had disappeared. The ride home had been tense, with James speaking of wedding plans while Elizabeth maintained a stony silence. Now, well past midnight, sleep eluded her. The walls of her comfortable bedroom felt like a prison, the future closing in like storm clouds on the horizon. A soft nickering from the corral drew her to the window. In the moonlight, she saw a figure moving quietly among the horses. Maka, preparing to ride out. Without pausing to consider propriety, Elizabeth threw a shawl over her nightdress and slipped downstairs. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain as she hurried toward the corral. Maka turned at her approach, surprise briefly crossing his features before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. "Where are you going?" she asked quietly. He gestured toward the distant mountains, then to the stars. "To think," she interpreted. "May I join you?" Hesitation crossed his face. He glanced toward the dark ranch house. "Please," Elizabeth said. "I need to explain about today." After a moment, he nodded once. As she moved to saddle her mare, he stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm, then pointed to Thunder. "You want me to ride Thunder?" she asked, surprised. Maka nodded, something like pride in his eyes. The stallion had come far in their weeks of training, but Elizabeth had never ridden him outside the corral. "Together?" she clarified. Another nod. He cupped his hands to help her mount, then swung up behind her with fluid grace. The sensation of his chest against her back sent a warmth through Elizabeth that had nothing to do with the summer night. Thunder moved beneath them, powerful and sure, no longer the wild beast that had bucked off countless cowboys. Maka guided him with the lightest touch of his knees, leaving his hands free to steady Elizabeth when necessary. They rode in silence through moonlit meadows, climbing steadily toward a mesa overlooking the valley. At the top, Maka dismounted and helped Elizabeth down. Thunder wandered a short distance away to graze, no tether needed. The view stole Elizabeth's breath. Endless sky scattered with stars, the silvered landscape stretching to the horizon. Their ranch a collection of tiny squares in the distance. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Maka nodded, then withdrew his small notebook and pencil, writing by moonlight, "Like freedom." The simple words resonated deeply. Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter despite the warm night. "I didn't agree to marry him," she said abruptly. "James just announced it without my consent." Maka's expression remained carefully neutral as he wrote, "Your father approves." "Because of money," she admitted. "The ranch is mortgaged to the Harrington Bank." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He hesitated, then wrote, "Hard choice, is it?" Elizabeth turned to face him fully. "What would you choose, security without happiness, or risk everything for?" She trailed off, unsure how to name the feeling that had grown between them. Maka stood very still, moonlight sculpting his features into sharp relief. Finally, he wrote, "Cannot choose for you. That's not what I asked." He looked away, then back to her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote, "I would choose freedom, always." The night breeze picked up, carrying the scent of rain stronger now. Elizabeth shivered, and Maka reached into his saddlebag, withdrawing a folded star quilt of intricate design. He wrapped it around her shoulders, his fingers brushing her collarbone. "It's beautiful," she said, touching the geometric patterns. "Where did you get it?" "My grandmother made it," he wrote. "Before." Elizabeth understood what before meant, before the cavalry, before the massacre. She clutched the quilt tighter, honored by the trust implied in sharing this precious connection to his past. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood in silence, closer than propriety would allow, yet not touching. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken words. Elizabeth found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something beyond her understanding. Maka's eyes darkened as he watched her, his usual composure wavering. He bent his head slowly toward hers, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips were a breath apart when thunder suddenly whinnied, head up and alert. Maka pulled back instantly, turning toward whatever had disturbed the horse. In the distance, riders approached, at least 3, moving fast across the moonlit landscape. Who would be out at this hour? Elizabeth wondered aloud. Maka's expression hardened as he quickly gathered their things, gesturing urgently for her to mount. Whatever brief magic had shimmered between them vanished, replaced by a tension she recognized from the day Lieutenant Crawford had appeared. "What is it?" she asked as he swung up behind her. He didn't answer, only turned thunder toward home with a new urgency, the star quilt still wrapped protectively around her shoulders. They rode hard, thunder's powerful strides eating up the distance. Maka kept them to the shadows of ridgelines, avoiding open ground whenever possible. Elizabeth sensed his urgency but didn't understand it until they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch. Orange flames licked at the night sky from the northern grazing lands. Distant figures on horseback drove cattle through broken fencing, while others approached the darkened ranch house. "Rustlers," Elizabeth gasped. Maka nodded grimly, guiding thunder down the slope at a controlled pace, remaining in the cover of juniper trees. When they reached the edge of the property, he dismounted and helped Elizabeth down, then withdrew something from his saddlebag, a hunting knife with a bone handle, worn smooth from years of use. "We need to warn Father and the hands," Elizabeth whispered. Maka shook his head, pointing to the bunkhouse where lanterns already glowed. The ranch hands were awake, probably alerted by the cattle's distress. But smoke now rose from that direction too. The rustlers had set fire to the hay storage to create chaos. He gestured for Elizabeth to stay put, but she shook her head fiercely. "This is my home. I'm coming with you." Something like admiration flickered in his eyes before he nodded once, motioning for her to stay low and follow him. They crept through the shadows toward the main house, every sense alert. Elizabeth had never seen Maka move like this. Fluid as water, silent as a hunting cat, every motion precise and purposeful. A shout erupted from the bunkhouse area, followed by gunfire. Elizabeth flinched, but Maka remained steady, leading her around to the back of the house where her father kept a shotgun above the kitchen door. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Elizabeth reached for a lamp, but Maka stopped her hand, shaking his head. They navigated by moonlight through the familiar rooms until raised voices from the front porch froze them in place. "Montgomery, get out here," a rough voice demanded. "We just want to talk business." Thomas's voice responded from upstairs. "I don't conduct business with thieves in the night." More gunfire erupted from the direction of the bunkhouse. Elizabeth peered through the window to see Charlie and 2 ranch hands pinned down behind a water trough, exchanging shots with rustlers. "Your hands are occupied," the voice outside called. "And the law's too far to help. Come out or we'll burn you out." Maka touched Elizabeth's arm, then gestured toward the back stairs that led to her father's bedroom. He made a circular motion with his finger, then pointed outside. "You're going around?" she whispered. He nodded, then pointed to her, then upstairs. "I'll get Father." She understood. "Be careful." For a heartbeat, His hand rested against her cheek, the gesture speaking volumes his voice could not. Then he was gone, slipping through the back door like a shadow. Elizabeth crept upstairs to find her father loading his rifle by the window. "Father," she hissed. Thomas whirled, nearly firing before recognizing his daughter. "Elizabeth, where have you been? I thought they'd taken you." "I was with Maka," she explained quickly. "We saw the rustlers from the hills. He's circling around to help." "One man against a dozen?" Thomas shook his head grimly. "I've counted at least 10 of them, Charlie, and the boys are pinned down." A crash from downstairs indicated the front door being broken in. Thomas positioned himself at the top of the stairs, rifle ready. "Stay behind me," he ordered. Outside, a sudden commotion erupted, shouts of confusion, then pain. Elizabeth risked a glance through the window to see 2 rustlers on the ground, a third staggering with his hand clutching his shoulder. Maka moved among them like a vengeful spirit, his knife flashing in the firelight. "The Apaches turned the tables," Thomas muttered in amazement. "But they'll kill him once they regroup." Elizabeth's mind raced. "The stallion," she said suddenly. "Thunder. What about him? Trust me." She darted down the back stairs before her father could stop her, emerging into the chaos of the night. The rustlers had focused their attention on Maka now, giving Charlie and the hands an opening to advance. Elizabeth ran for the corral where Thunder paced nervously, agitated by the gunfire and shouting. She flung open the gate, then placed her fingers in her mouth and whistled sharply, a signal she and Maka had developed during training. Thunder hesitated only a moment before charging toward the sound, his massive form materializing out of the darkness like an avenging spirit. Elizabeth whistled again, directing him toward the rustlers surrounding Maka. The men barely had time to register the thundering hooves before the stallion was upon them, rearing and striking with lethal precision. They scattered in panic, their formation broken. Elizabeth seized a fallen rustler's rifle and fired into the air. "This is Montgomery land," she shouted, "and we defend what's ours." Through the chaos, her eyes met Maka's across the yard. Blood streaked his face, not his own, but his eyes shone with a fierce pride as he nodded to her. They were, in that moment, perfectly matched. Her fire and his steel, united in defense of what they both held dear. A bullet whizzed past her ear, bringing her sharply back to reality. She dove for cover as Maka actually shouted a warning. The sound of his voice, unused for so many years, cut through the night like a thunderclap, stunning everyone into momentary stillness. That single heartbeat of surprise was all they needed. Thunder charged again as Charlie and the hands advanced, and the tide of the battle turned. Dawn broke over the Montgomery ranch, revealing the night's devastation in harsh clarity. The hay barn smoldered, fence lines lay broken, and blood stained the packed earth of the yard. But the rustlers had fled, leaving 2 of their wounded behind for the sheriff to collect. Most importantly, the main house stood undamaged, and the majority of the cattle remained safely in Montgomery possession. In the kitchen, Elizabeth pressed a cloth to the gash on Maka's side where a rustler's knife had caught him during the fight. He sat shirtless on a wooden chair, his bronze skin marked with both fresh wounds and old scars, a testament to a life of survival. "This needs stitching," she said, examining the wound. "It's deep." Maka shook his head, then gestured toward his saddlebag, which Charlie had brought in from where Thunder now rested in the corral. Elizabeth retrieved it, watching as Maka withdrew a small leather pouch of herbs and roots. He pointed to the stove, then made a boiling motion with his hands. "You want me to boil these?" Elizabeth asked, receiving a nod in return. As she prepared the herbal mixture according to his gestures, Thomas entered the kitchen, his face haggard from the long night. "Sheriff's taken the prisoners to town," he reported. "They're not talking yet, but he suspects they're part of the McCready gang from down south." His eyes fell on Maka's wound. That needs a doctor. He has his own medicine, Elizabeth explained, bringing the steaming pot to the table. He's showing me how to prepare it. Thomas watched as Maka dipped a clean cloth into the aromatic liquid, then applied it to his side, his face betraying only the slightest flinch. Never seen a man fight like you did last night, he said finally. Charlie says you took down 4 men before they knew what hit them. Maka merely inclined his head slightly, neither accepting nor rejecting the praise. And that business with Thunder, Thomas continued, shaking his head in amazement. Elizabeth said you two have been training him to respond to signals, but I never imagined. He saved all of us, Elizabeth said, helping Maka apply more of the herbal compress. Thunder and Maka both. Thomas nodded slowly. I owe you more than thanks, he told Maka directly. You saved my daughter, my home, my livelihood. He extended his hand. I won't forget it. Maka accepted the handshake, something shifting in the air between the two men. Respect, finally untainted by prejudice. As Thomas left to oversee repairs, Elizabeth continued tending to Maka's wounds. Besides the knife gash, he had a cut above his eye and bruising across his knuckles. She worked in comfortable silence, learning to apply the herbal remedies as he directed with gentle hands. You called out, she said finally, her voice soft, to warn me. You used your voice. Maka's eyes met hers, something vulnerable in their depths. He reached for his notebook, but Elizabeth placed her hand over his. Try, she encouraged gently. If you want to. He swallowed, his throat working. After a long moment, he whispered, Elizabeth. The sound was rough from disuse, but her name in his voice made her heart stutter. Yes, she breathed, eyes welling with unexpected tears. That's right. His hand came up to touch a tear as it slid down her cheek, his expression wondering. Don't cry. He managed each word clearly in effort. Happy tears, she explained, covering his hand with hers. I'm honored to hear your voice after so long. They sat in silence again, but it was different now, charged with possibility. Elizabeth finished bandaging his side with strips of clean linen, her fingers lingering on his skin longer than necessary. Maka watched her face as she worked, his usual guardedness softened by exhaustion and something else she couldn't name. Why now? She asked softly. After all these years? He struggled visibly, then whispered, Feared. For you. More than my fear. The simple truth of it washed over her. In that moment of danger, his need to protect her had been stronger than the trauma that had silenced him for 14 years. Thunder nickered outside the window, drawing their attention. The stallion stood at the fence, watching the house as if keeping guard. He hasn't left that spot since the fighting ended, Elizabeth said. It's like he's protecting us. Protects his herd, Maka whispered, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Elizabeth's hand found his, their fingers intertwining on the kitchen table. Rest now, she urged. You need to heal. He nodded, fatigue evident in every line of his body. But as she rose to prepare a pallet for him near the kitchen fire, his hand tightened briefly on hers. Stay, he whispered, the single word carrying a weight of meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. I'll be right here, she promised, pulling her chair closer to his. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the sun climbed higher, illuminating the damaged ranch and the work that lay ahead. But in the quiet of the kitchen, something new and fragile was healing, finding its voice after years of silence. 3 days after the attack, James Harrington arrived at the Montgomery ranch in his father's carriage, a bouquet of store-bought flowers in one hand and concern etched on his handsome face. Or at least what passed for concern. Elizabeth, my dear, he called, spotting her in the corral with Thunder. I just heard about the rustlers. How terrifying for you. Elizabeth's spine stiffened at his tone, as if she were some delicate creature in need of protection rather than a woman who had helped fight off armed attackers. "We managed," she replied coolly. James's gaze shifted to where Maka sat mending tack in the shade of the barn, his injured side still bandaged beneath his shirt. "Yes, I heard your hired hand was involved." He said the words with barely concealed distaste. "Your father's inside?" "In his study." Elizabeth returned her attention to Thunder, effectively dismissing James, who frowned before heading toward the house. Inside Thomas's study, the conversation took a different turn entirely. "This came by courier this morning," Thomas said without preamble, sliding a document across his desk to James. "Care to explain?" James glanced at the bank notice, his expression carefully neutral. "Just a standard foreclosure warning, Thomas. Nothing to concern yourself with." "Nothing to," Thomas sputtered. "It says we have 14 days to pay the full balance or forfeit the property." "A formality," James assured him, settling into the chair opposite. "Given recent events, the bank needs to protect its interests. The Rustler attack raises questions about the security of our investment." "Our investment?" Thomas repeated coldly. "This land has been in Montgomery hands for 20 years. And it can remain so," James said smoothly. "My father is prepared to extend very generous terms, if certain conditions are met." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What conditions?" "My marriage to Elizabeth, of course." James straightened his cuffs. "As her husband, I would ensure the ranch stays in the family, so to speak. You're blackmailing me with my own property. I prefer to think of it as securing our mutual futures." James's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The wedding should take place quickly, within the week." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, he could see Elizabeth and Maka working with Thunder, their movements in perfect harmony despite the Apache's injury. Something had changed between them since the attack. A new ease, a silent understanding that was obvious even from a distance. "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked quietly. "Then the bank forecloses, and the property goes to auction." James shrugged. "Where, coincidentally, my father will be the highest bidder." Thomas gripped the windowsill, knuckles white. "Does Elizabeth know about this arrangement?" "Not yet." James rose to stand beside him. "I thought it best coming from you, her beloved father." Outside, Elizabeth laughed at something Maka had said. Thomas realized with shock. The Apache was speaking, his lips forming words that made his daughter's face light up with joy. "She won't agree," Thomas murmured. "She will if you ask her to," James countered. "For your sake. For the legacy you've built for her." He placed a paternal hand on Thomas's shoulder. "It's not such a terrible fate being my wife. She'll have security, position, children who won't be." He stopped himself. "Won't be what?" Thomas turned, eyes hard. James met his gaze unflinchingly. "Half-breeds," he finished. "Let's not pretend we don't both see what's happening out there." Thomas's jaw clenched. "Get out. Think about it, Thomas." James headed for the door. 14 days. Your daughter's happiness, or your family's legacy? Your choice." After James departed, Thomas sank into his chair, the bank notice cruel and impersonal before him. He'd hidden the ranch's financial troubles from Elizabeth for years, shouldering the burden alone as drought and changing markets whittled away their security. Now there was no more hiding. He found Elizabeth in the kitchen, preparing a poultice of Maka's healing herbs for his wound. The Apache sat nearby, his voice still rough but growing stronger as he named each plant in both his language and English. Elizabeth repeated the words carefully, her face alight with interest. "Father," she greeted him. "Did you know that this root—" "What was it called again, Maka?" "Osha," he supplied quietly. "Yes, Osha. It fights infection and helps with pain. Maka's teaching me the old ways of healing." Thomas couldn't bear to extinguish the light in her eyes, but time was running out. "Elizabeth," he said heavily, "we need to talk." Something in his tone made her set down the herbs. "What's wrong?" Maka began to rise, sensing a private conversation, but Thomas shook his head. "Stay. This concerns you too, I suspect." He placed the bank notice on the table between them. Elizabeth read it quickly, her face paling. "Foreclosure? But I thought the loans were under control." "They were until last year's drought," Thomas admitted. "I've been juggling debts, taking new loans to pay old ones. The Harrington Bank holds them all now." "And James knows this," Elizabeth said, understanding dawning. "That's why he's been so persistent." "He just made their terms clear," Thomas confirmed. "They'll extend the loan indefinitely, if you marry him within the week." Elizabeth's hand found Makara's on the table, their fingers intertwining instinctively. "And if I refuse? We lose everything. The land, the house, the cattle." Thomas's voice broke slightly. "Everything I've built for you." Silence fell heavy in the kitchen. Then Maka spoke, each word measured and deliberate. "I will go," he said quietly. "Make it easier." "No." Elizabeth turned to him fiercely. "That solves nothing. Gives you choice," he replied, his dark eyes somber. "Without me complicating." "There's no choice at all if you leave," she whispered, tears threatening. Thomas watched them, seeing the depth of feeling neither tried to hide anymore. His heart ached for his daughter, caught between duty and desire, just as her mother had been with him all those years ago. The morning of Elizabeth's wedding dawned clear and bright, mocking her heavy heart. In her bedroom, Martha fussed with the elaborate white gown that had arrived from Phoenix the day before, a gift from James that felt more like shackles with each passing moment. "Stand still, child," Martha chided gently. "These buttons are fiddlier than a new colt." Elizabeth stared at her reflection in the mirror, a stranger looking back at her. The dress was beautiful by any standard. Ivory silk with lace trim, a fashionable bustle, and seed pearls adorning the bodice. It was also stifling, constraining her ribs and making it difficult to take a full breath. "It's too tight," she protested weakly. "It's the latest style," Martha countered, though her eyes reflected understanding. "Miss Elizabeth, are you certain about this marriage? There might be another way." "What other way?" Elizabeth asked dully. "Let father lose everything he's worked for? Let the hands lose their livelihoods? Let Thunder be sold to the highest bidder?" She shook her head. "I made my choice," though choice hardly described her capitulation 3 days ago. James had been triumphant, her father defeated, and Maka had disappeared the morning after their confrontation in the kitchen, taking only his few possessions and leaving without goodbye. Thunder had been inconsolable, racing the fence line and calling for his missing trainer. Elizabeth had wept into the stallion's mane, unable to explain to the animal what she herself could barely comprehend. A knock at the bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. Thomas entered, dressed in his best suit, his expression grave. "You look beautiful," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Just like your mother." Elizabeth attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Is it time?" "Soon." The preachers arrived, and the Harringtons. Thomas hesitated. "Elizabeth, I want you to know." A commotion from downstairs cut him off. Raised voices, then the distinctive sound of spurs on the wooden floor. Father and daughter exchanged puzzled looks before hurrying to investigate, Elizabeth gathering her cumbersome skirts as best she could. In the parlor, where flowers and ribbons had transformed the room for the ceremony, Lieutenant Crawford stood in full uniform, flanked by 2 other cavalry officers. James Harrington faced them, his expression a mixture of outrage and poorly concealed panic. "This is preposterous," James was saying. "On my wedding day, no less." "What's happening?" Thomas demanded, entering with Elizabeth behind him. Crawford turned, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Montgomery, Miss Montgomery, my apologies for the intrusion, but this couldn't wait." He extended an official-looking document. "I have a warrant for James Harrington's arrest." "Arrest?" Elizabeth echoed, a flutter of something like hope rising in her chest. "On what charges?" "Conspiracy with known rustlers," Crawford stated flatly. "Specifically, the McCready gang that attacked your ranch last week." The room erupted in exclamations of shock and disbelief. James's father pushed forward, his face mottled with rage. "This is absurd. My son is a respected businessman. Your son," Crawford continued implacably, "has been financing rustling operations across 3 territories, targeting ranches in financial distress, then using the Harrington Bank to foreclose on properties devalued by cattle theft." Elizabeth felt the room sway slightly. "You arranged the attack on our ranch?" she asked James directly. "You put everyone in danger. People could have died." James's handsome face twisted. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way. They were just supposed to take enough cattle to push your father to the brink, make him more amenable to our arrangement." "How did you discover this?" Thomas asked Crawford. "One of the rustlers we captured started talking, hoping for leniency." Crawford's gaze shifted to the doorway. But the real breakthrough came from him. Everyone turned to see Maka standing in the entrance, dressed not in his usual work clothes but in a clean white shirt and dark pants. His hair was pulled back neatly, his posture straight and dignified. "Maka?" Elizabeth breathed, hardly believing her eyes. "Mr. Maka came to the fort 3 days ago," Crawford explained, "with evidence of Mr. Harrington's involvement, including correspondence found on one of the rustlers during the attack." "You searched them?" Thomas asked Maka, surprised. Maka nodded, then spoke clearly, his voice stronger than Elizabeth had yet heard it. "I recognized the leader, had seen him with Harrington in town." "You lying savage!" James lunged toward Maka but was restrained by one of the officers. "No one will believe an Apache over me." "The bank records confirm everything," Crawford said coldly, "as does the testimony of your former clerk, who kept a separate ledger of these transactions." As the officers led a protesting James away, followed by his shocked father, the wedding guests began to disperse in a buzz of scandalized whispers. Elizabeth stood frozen in her elaborate dress, torn between elation at her narrow escape and horror at how close she'd come to marrying such a man. When the room had cleared except for her immediate family, her eyes found Maka's. "You left," she said softly, "without saying goodbye." "Had to," he replied, stepping closer, "to find truth, to set you free." Outside, a familiar whinny broke the tension. Through the window, Elizabeth saw Thunder pacing the front yard, somehow escaped from his corral again, as if sensing the momentous events unfolding. Inside, autumn painted the Arizona hills in russet and gold as Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching riders approach in the distance. 6 weeks had passed since her near-wedding day, bringing changes no one could have predicted. The Harrington scandal had rocked the territory. Both James and his father now sat in Phoenix awaiting trial, their bank under government supervision. Ranchers who had lost land to their schemes were being offered restitution, including the Montgomerys, though the process would take time. "Is that them?" Thomas asked, joining his daughter at the railing. Elizabeth nodded, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. Right on time. After James's arrest, they had faced the harsh reality that even without the Harringtons' machinations, the ranch couldn't continue as before. The drought had taken too great a toll, and their debts remained substantial. Difficult decisions had to be made. "I still don't know if this is the right choice," Thomas admitted, his voice carrying the weight of a man seeing his life's work transformed. "It's the only one that makes sense," Elizabeth replied gently. "We keep the heart of the ranch, the best grazing land, and the house. The eastern section was always too dry for cattle anyway. The riders drew closer, Lieutenant Crawford at the lead, followed by several tribal representatives from the San Carlos Reservation. Behind them rolled a wagon carrying the government agent who would witness the signing. Thomas straightened his shoulders. Never thought I'd be selling Montgomery land to the government for an Apache farming project. Not selling, Elizabeth corrected. Partnering. There's a difference. The arrangement had been Maka's suggestion. The eastern portion of Montgomery land bordered reservation territory and had access to a year-round spring. The government, seeking to appease growing criticism of reservation conditions, had agreed to fund an experimental farming cooperative where Apache families could work their own plots while learning modern agricultural techniques. Maka emerged from the barn, Thunder following at his heels like an oversized dog. The stallion had finally earned his freedom from the corral, now responding to voice commands with perfect reliability. "Ready?" Elizabeth asked as Maka joined them on the porch. He nodded, taking her hand briefly. His speech had improved steadily over the weeks, though he still chose his words carefully. "New beginning," he said, the simple phrase carrying layers of meaning. Crawford dismounted first, approaching with a respectful nod. The relationship between the lieutenant and Maka remained complex. Crawford had admitted his regiment's involvement in raids years before, though he'd been a junior officer following orders. His efforts to bring the Harringtons to justice had been his own form of atonement. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Montgomery," Crawford greeted them. "The documents are prepared as discussed." Inside, at the dining table where Elizabeth had once reluctantly agreed to marry James, a very different contract was now signed. Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he added his name beside the government agent's, but his expression was resolute. "It's done," the agent announced. "The eastern section will be transferred to the San Carlos Cooperative, with water rights shared between both properties." One of the Apache elders stepped forward, offering Thomas a ceremonial pipe. "Our peoples now share this land," he said in careful English, "as it was before any fences." Thomas accepted the gesture with unexpected grace. "My daughter deserves the credit for seeing the wisdom in this arrangement." All eyes turned to Elizabeth, standing tall in her practical riding clothes, Maka at her side. In the weeks since the wedding that wasn't, they had moved carefully, mindful of community gossip. But today, with the new beginning formalized, she felt the last constraints falling away. "There's one more announcement," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Maka and I intend to marry, with my father's blessing." Thomas nodded, his initial reservations softened by watching their partnership flourish. "The ranch will be theirs to run," he added. "I'm retiring to that fishing cabin I've been promising myself for 20 years. Later, as the visitors departed and twilight descended, Elizabeth and Maka stood at the corral where their story had begun. Thunder grazed nearby, no longer separated by wooden barriers. "Never thought," Maka said, his arm around her waist. "That day in corral, this ending." "Not ending," Elizabeth corrected, turning in his embrace. "Beginning." She reached up to touch the small scar above his eye, a remnant of the night he had fought to protect her home, now their home. "Remember what you wrote that night in the cave. We are not what happened to us. We are what we choose now." He smiled, a full, unguarded expression that transformed his solemn face. "Choose you," he said simply. "Choose us." As the first stars appeared above the ranch that had nearly torn them apart before bringing them together, Elizabeth and Maka mounted Thunder's broad back together, the untamable beast now carrying them forward in perfect harmony, into a future neither could have imagined. That hot summer day when a proud rancher's daughter had boasted, "No man can ride this beast."